her face. Daniel Whitfield expected the same reaction he had grown used to over 3 years of marriage. A flinch, a lowered head, a quiet apology for whatever imagined offense had set him off that evening. Instead, he watched the woman standing before him straighten her shoulders and hold his gaze without a single tremor. Her eyes did not fill with tears the way Grace's always had. They simply studied him, calm and unreadable, the way a soldier studies an enemy position before deciding how to move. Daniel felt something shift in his chest that he could not name, a small crack in the confidence he had carried into that room, though he had no idea yet what had truly walked through his front door that night. 3 weeks earlier, on a base thousands of miles from that kitchen, Emily had been running through a training exercise when her phone buzzed against her hip during a break. She almost let it go to voicemail, the way she usually did during deployment cycles, but something told her to answer. Grace's voice came through broken and small, apologizing before she had even said what was wrong, the way people do when they have learned that their pain is an inconvenience to others. She told Emily about a broken wrist explained away as a fall down the stairs, about missed family gatherings excused as work commitments, about a husband who smiled for photographs and turned cold the instant a camera was gone. What Daniel never knew about the woman he married was that she came from a family built on an unusual kind of loyalty, one shared between 3 sisters who had been inseparable since before they could speak. Grace, Emily, and their 3rd sister Olivia Carter had been born within 11 minutes of each other, raised in a household that taught them early that blood meant more than convenience, that protecting one another was not a suggestion but an obligation. As children, they had developed a habit of finishing each other's sentences, predicting each other's moods, sensing distress before a single word was spoken. That connection had only deepened as they grew older, even as their lives pulled them into entirely different directions. Daniel had courted Grace with a kind of attentiveness that made her feel chosen above every other woman he had ever known. He remembered small details she mentioned in passing, showed up with her favorite coffee before she had even finished complaining about a long week, told her within the first 2 months that he had never felt this way about anyone before. Her sisters had liked him at first, charmed the same way Grace had been, though Emily later admitted she had noticed something faintly performative in the way he complimented Grace in front of others, as though he were building a case for himself rather than simply expressing affection. At the time, she dismissed the thought as nothing more than a soldier's habit of overanalyzing everything. Daniel, meanwhile, had built himself a reputation among co-workers and neighbors as an easygoing, generous man, the kind who remembered birthdays and volunteered for community events, the kind people described as a catch when Grace first introduced him. Few people ever saw the version of him that existed behind closed doors, the version that kept a running list of grievances against his wife, that measured her worth against an impossible standard he alone controlled, that used silence as a weapon just as effectively as raised voices. He had learned, over years of careful practice, exactly how far he could push before anyone outside the marriage might notice, and he had never once come close to that line. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the kind that should have blended into every other evening of that year. Grace had forgotten to pick up dry cleaning Daniel wanted for a work event, a mistake so small it would have meant nothing in any healthy relationship. Instead, it triggered an outburst that left her with a fractured wrist and a story about slipping on wet kitchen tile that she repeated so many times over the following days that she nearly believed it herself. It was after that incident, alone in a locked bathroom with her arm throbbing and her breath shaking, that Grace finally reached for her phone and called the sister she knew would answer without judgment or hesitation. Emily requested emergency leave within hours of that phone call, citing a family medical situation that was not entirely a lie. She spent the flight home running through everything Grace had told her, building a mental timeline of incidents, cross-referencing dates against injuries Grace had once explained away to family members over the phone. By the time she landed, she had already decided that simply removing Grace from the house would not be enough. Daniel Whitfield had spent years learning exactly how to avoid consequences, and Emily understood, in the disciplined and methodical way she understood most things, that ending this properly would require more than a quiet departure and a change of locks. The 3 sisters met at Olivia's house 2 days later, gathered around her kitchen table with the curtains drawn, speaking in low voices out of habit even though no one could possibly overhear them. Grace sat wrapped in a blanket, her wrist in a temporary brace, listening as her sisters worked through what would happen next. Olivia offered her home as a safe place for Grace to recover, away from anyone who might report her presence back to Daniel. Emily proposed something far bolder, an idea that made Olivia go quiet for a long moment before she finally nodded, understanding that her sister had never been the type to walk away from a threat when she believed she could neutralize it instead. The plan was simple in concept and demanding in execution. Emily would step into Grace's life entirely, adopting her mannerisms, her voice, her daily patterns, while Grace disappeared to heal both physically and emotionally under Olivia's care. Emily would gather documented evidence of Daniel's behavior from the inside, evidence that would hold up beyond a single frightened woman's testimony, evidence that could not be dismissed, minimized, or twisted the way abusers so often twisted the accounts of the people they controlled. It meant living under the same roof as a man capable of real violence. But Emily had spent years training for situations that demanded exactly this kind of composure under threat. For nearly a week before the swap, Emily studied her sister with the same intensity she once applied to reconnaissance briefings. She watched hours of home videos, listened to voicemails Grace had saved, memorized the rhythm of her sister's laughter, and the particular way she paused before answering a difficult question. Grace, despite her exhaustion, found herself laughing for the first time in months as she coached her sister through small habits Daniel would expect to see. The way she stirred her coffee, the playlist she hummed while cooking, the specific brand of lotion she kept beside the bathroom sink. It felt, for a few strange hours, like preparing for a role in a play neither of them had ever imagined performing. The morning of the swap arrived with a tension none of the sisters spoke aloud. Emily dressed in Grace's clothes, adjusted her hair to match the style Grace had worn for the past year, and studied her own reflection until she could see her sister looking back at her rather than herself. Olivia drove Grace to a quiet property 2 hours outside the city, a place their aunt had left vacant after moving into assisted living, far enough removed from Daniel's usual circles that no accidental encounter could unravel the plan. Emily, meanwhile, drove herself to the house she now had to think of as home, gripping the steering wheel with the same steady hands she had once used to hold a weapon steady under pressure. Walking through that front door for the first time as her sister, Emily felt the weight of everything Grace had endured settle over her all at once. The careful quiet of a house designed to avoid provoking its occupant, the way certain rooms felt colder than others despite identical thermostats, the small dents in drywall that had clearly been patched and painted over more than once. She moved through the space slowly, memorizing details, understanding on a level deeper than any briefing document could convey exactly what her sister had survived in silence for years. By the time Daniel came home that evening, Emily had already begun building the version of Grace he expected to find waiting for him. Their first exchange nearly gave everything away. Daniel mentioned a coworker's name Emily had no context for, watching her reaction carefully out of a habit built from years of testing his wife's attentiveness. Emily recovered quickly, offering a vague but plausible response she had prepared in advance for exactly this kind of gap, and Daniel seemed to accept it without suspicion, distracted by his own need to recount his day in exhaustive detail. It was in that first dinner, listening to him speak entirely about himself without a single question directed back at her, that Emily understood precisely how invisible her sister had become inside her own marriage, reduced to an audience for a man who required constant validation. Over the following days, Emily began documenting everything with the same meticulous discipline she applied to any assignment, keeping a small recorder hidden among Grace's belongings, photographing bank statements Daniel kept locked in a drawer he assumed his wife would never dare open, noting the specific language he used whenever his temper began to rise. She learned that his cruelty rarely announced itself directly, arriving instead through comments designed to erode confidence slowly, through financial restrictions disguised as budgeting concern, through a controlled temper that surfaced only when he calculated no witnesses were present to see it. It was on the 10th night of the swap that Daniel raised his hand for the first time, provoked by nothing more significant than a delayed response to a question about dinner plans. Emily saw it coming a full second before it happened, recognized the shift in his posture, the tightening of his jaw, the particular stillness that preceded violence in men who had never faced real consequences for their actions. She did not flinch. She did not retreat. She simply absorbed the strike with the same discipline she had once used to absorb far worse in training exercises designed to prepare soldiers for situations no civilian should ever have to endure. And then she looked at him with an expression that made Daniel Whitfield feel, for the first time in his marriage, genuinely uncertain of what might happen next. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. In the days that followed that first strike, Emily continued gathering evidence with a patience that surprised even her, understanding that a single incident, however damning, would never be enough to secure the kind of outcome her sister deserved. She began cataloging patterns rather than isolated moments, documenting how Daniel's temper correlated with financial stress at his workplace, how his cruelty intensified whenever Grace, or now Emily in her place, expressed any form of independence. She noted the names of co-workers he mentioned with unusual frequency, filing away details that painted a fuller picture of a man who had spent years perfecting the art of controlling how others perceived him. Meanwhile, at the quiet property 2 hours outside the city, Grace was beginning the slow process of remembering who she had been before Daniel Whitfield entered her life. Olivia stayed close throughout those early days, cooking meals neither of them finished, sitting in comfortable silence when conversation felt like too much effort, gently encouraging her sister to speak when she seemed ready and never pushing when she wasn't. Grace spent long afternoons on the porch watching the fields beyond the property line, feeling something like relief for the first time in years, though it came tangled with guilt over leaving Emily behind to face the man she herself had spent so long trying to survive. Daniel's suspicion did not arrive all at once, but accumulated gradually, the way water finds its way through even the smallest crack in a foundation. He began asking pointed questions about Grace's day, testing responses against details he half remembered from months earlier, watching for hesitation that might reveal something he could not yet name. He mentioned, almost casually one evening, an inside joke from their honeymoon that Emily had no knowledge of, watching her reaction with the practiced attentiveness of a man accustomed to catching his wife in small deceptions. Emily deflected smoothly, citing exhaustion and stress, but she understood that the margin for error was narrowing with each passing week. It was around this time that Daniel began confiding in his closest friend from work, a man named Marcus who had known him since college and had long suspected, without ever voicing it directly, that something was not entirely right in his friend's marriage. Daniel described his wife's recent behavior as strange, distant, almost like living with a different person entirely, framing his own confusion as concern rather than the quiet unraveling of control he actually felt. Marcus, uneasy but unwilling to challenge a friendship built over 2 decades, suggested only that marriages went through phases, that perhaps Grace simply needed space, never imagining how close to the literal truth his casual reassurance actually was. Emily, unaware of these private conversations but sensing the shift in Daniel's demeanor, decided the time had come to accelerate her plan rather than wait for the walls to close in entirely. She began reaching out carefully to people in Grace's life who had drifted away over the years, reconnecting with a former coworker here, a childhood friend there, laying the groundwork for a support network that would surround her sister once the truth finally came to light. Each conversation was measured, deliberate, designed to rebuild bridges without raising alarm, though more than one old friend commented on how different Grace seemed, sharper somehow, more present than she had been in years. Emily photographed every document carefully, replacing each folder exactly as she had found it, understanding that even the smallest disturbance could alert Daniel to what she had discovered. She left the office that evening with a growing certainty that this situation extended beyond what any of them had originally understood, that Daniel Whitfield had been preparing, consciously or not, for a future where Grace might eventually try to leave him, and had structured his finances in ways designed to leave her with nothing if that day ever came. The revelation added a new urgency to Emily's timeline, one she communicated carefully to her sisters during a brief, coded phone call disguised as an ordinary check-in. Grace, upon hearing the news from Olivia, felt something shift inside her that had little to do with fear and everything to do with a slow, building resolve. For years she had blamed herself for the deterioration of her marriage, wondering what she might have done differently to prevent Daniel's anger, absorbing his cruelty as though it were somehow a reflection of her own inadequacy rather than a choice he made repeatedly and deliberately. Learning the extent of his calculated financial control stripped away the last of her self-doubt, replacing it with a clarity that had been buried beneath years of careful, exhausting survival. Back at the house, Emily sensed Daniel's paranoia deepening as the weeks progressed, watching him grow increasingly erratic in small, telling ways. He began arriving home earlier than usual, unannounced, as though testing whether he might catch her in some unexplainable circumstance. He questioned her more frequently about phone calls she made, about time spent away from the house running errands, about anything that suggested independence he no longer felt entirely comfortable granting. Emily met each interrogation with the same calm precision she had shown from the beginning, though she understood that his suspicion was no longer a distant possibility but an active, developing threat to the plan they had built so carefully. The confrontation that finally cracked the surface came on a rain-soaked evening nearly a month into the swap, when Daniel returned home unexpectedly early and found Emily on the phone with Olivia, speaking in a tone and cadence that struck him as unmistakably unfamiliar. He stood silently in the doorway for several seconds before she noticed him, watching her end the call with practiced ease, though something in his expression told her that whatever he had overheard had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of the woman standing before him. He said nothing that night, offering only a strange, searching look before retreating to his office and closing the door, leaving Emily standing alone in the hallway with the unsettling awareness that the careful balance she had maintained for weeks had